Ever felt overwhelmed trying to manage your computer's storage? What if I told you that understanding partitions and file systems could save you from data loss, slow performance, and even hardware failures? In this video, we'll break down everything you need to know, from the basics of disk partitioning to choosing the right file system for your needs. Whether you're using Windows, Mac, or Linux, you'll walk away with the skills to optimize your storage like a pro. Ready to take control of your tech? Let's dive in. Welcome to this new course, where we will see the different types of partitions on a disk, the types of possible system formatting, and we'll finish with the difference between a quick and normal formatting. And so, let's start with the partitions. In computing, a partition is a section of a storage medium. Whether it is a hard drive, a memory card, or a USB flash drive, it is thanks to the partition that it is possible to install several operating systems on the same hard drive. In fact, you can see the partition as if you were physically dividing the hard drive into several other disks. It is important to know that each operating system has a different way of partitioning these disks. Like what? On Windows systems, a partition disk will be denoted by letters followed by a colon, C, D, E, etc. For macOS systems, the identifier will be in the form disk NSM, where the N represents the support number and the M is the number of the score. For example, a partition named disk 1s5 corresponds to the fifth partition of disk 1. And for systems running on Linux, the identifier is in the form SDXN, where the X represents a letter for the medium, and N corresponds to the number of the score on the medium. For example, a partition in SDA3 is the third partition of disk A. We will now talk about the differences between a basic partition and a dynamic partition, which are configurations only available on Windows. The basic disk has been around since the creation of Windows, while the dynamic type appeared from Windows 2000. A disk that is in the basic format is based on a conventional format that uses partition tables or logical drives to manage the data on the hard disk. Whereas a dynamic disk will not use a partition table, but rather what is called dynamic volumes. In fact, they are called dynamic, simply because the volume can be expanded, even after you have already created the storage. You can see the partition type of your disks by going to your disk manager. Now let's talk about the terms primary and logic. Here, you just have to remember that a primary partition is intended to accommodate an operating system because it may be bootable. That is to say, that you can boot on it. A partition called logical will instead be reserved for storing data. That is to say, simply do backup. You won't be able to install an operating system and boot into it. It is also possible that you hear the term extended partition. With all these words, it is enough to be lost. An extended partition is the result of splitting a primary partition. Since a logical partition will never be primary partitions because it is not bootable, well, that's why the extended partition was created. It's just to have logical partitions in which we can store data. Basically, you just have to remember that a primary partition is used to boot the operating system, and that an extended partition allows you to create logical partitions that can only store data. That is to say, they are not bootable. MBR and GPT. As we are in a very theoretical part, well, we will continue by talking about the terms MBR, master boot record, and GPT, GID partition table, which are in fact partitioning tables for all operating systems, whether Windows, Linux, or Mac OS. The MBR standard is a bit old, since it has been around since 1983, and GPT partitioning is the successor to MBR, which was designed to remove the limitations of MBR. For example, with the master boot record, the MBR, it was impossible to create more than 4 primary partitions, unless you create extended partitions and then divide them into logical partitions. The problem with doing this workaround was that the memory was poorly optimized, which caused a lot of data loss or even outright hardware failures. In addition, the MBR can only manage a maximum of 2 terabytes of disk space. It is for these reasons that the GPT partitioning table was developed. Basically, the old partition type, MBR, is only recommended on older hardware that works with older versions of operating system. That's why today, you'll mostly only see partitioning tables in GPT. In fact, the important thing to remember is that with GPT, you can create an unlimited number of partitions. The limit will instead be imposed by the operating system. There is no longer a limit on the size of the disk either. And above all, we have a better optimization and security of this data file system. Now we're going to talk about something else, which are the different types of file systems that you can have on your hard drive. A file system is the way to store information from a storage medium and to organize it into files. FAT32, exFAT, and NTFS. And we start with 3 systems that are used in Windows. You have probably noticed, but when you want to format the data on one of your USB drives, you have the choice between either FAT32, exFAT, or NTFS. The FAT32 is part of the old FAT, File Allocation Table file system, which succeeded the FAT16, which is even older. You may have noticed, but the FAT32 has several limitations. For example, if you format a USB flash in FAT32 and you have downloaded the latest movie Bad Boys in 4K quality, then you will not be able to put it on your USB flash because the FAT32 is limited to 4 gigabytes per file. So, the solution would be to either format your USB flash drive in another file system or settle for the DivX version of the movie. The FAT32 is still widely used because the biggest advantage it has is that it is compatible with most operating systems, such as Windows, Android, iOS, or macOS. For example, if you have an MP3 car radio, well, you will have a better chance that it is compatible with FAT32 than any other file system. Let's move on to the exFAT, Extended File Allocation Table, which is simply, as the name suggests, an improvement on FAT32. Even though it is better than its predecessor, it is still less compatible with other devices. That is to say, it will not be recognized as well as the FAT32 in your car radio. On the other hand, for the time being, it is no longer limited in file size. So, you can even transfer an 8K movie to it without any problem. After that, it remains to be seen if it will be recognized by your TV in the living room. For example, I know that the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 don't support the exFAT. Well then, who still plays old generation consoles, except for the Nintendo Mini? And the latest is the NTFS format, which is a proprietary system developed by Microsoft. It will therefore be more likely to accommodate a system like Windows, as it allows to have encryption, to be able to compress files, and can also manage access permissions as well as the different levels of rights. That is to say, permissions. Now let's move on to the file systems that are reserved for Linux. These are the formats: ext2, second extended file system, ext3, third extended file system, and ext4, fourth extended file system. We will therefore detail the main differences of these 3 file systems, which I remind you are intended for a Linux environment. The ext2 partition was introduced in 1993. It is the first default file system, many distributions, such as Debian or Red Hat, the maximum file size can be from 16 gigabytes to 2 terabytes. And the overall size of a file system partition can be from 2 terabytes to 32 terabytes, which was huge for the time. The X3 partition was released in 2001. It has the same characteristics as its predecessor, except that a directory can contain up to 32,000 subdirectories. And it is since this version that it is possible to have a logging, that is to say, a follow-up of changes by the file system. Since the X3 type is very close to X2, it is possible to convert an X2 partition to X3 directly without having to format the data. And the X4 score arrived in 2008. Files can range from 16 gigabytes to 16 terabytes. A partition can reach more than 1 million terabytes, which is gigantic, and a directory can have more than 64,000 subdirectories. From the partition type X4, one has an option to disable logging. Swap partition. Since we're in the world of Linux, we're going to stay there and talk about the swap partition. The swap partition literally means exchange partition. This partition is a space dedicated to RAM overflow. That is, if the RAM fills up completely, well, all the other applications will come to run on the swap partition. So seen like this, we can say that it's a super easy way to increase the amount of memory usable by the computer without the need to buy a new RAM stick. Well, not necessarily, because RAM remains the fastest memory on the market. And that's even though today's hard drives are much faster than before with the new SSDs. To understand the role of the swap partition, we will detail its advantages and disadvantages. As we can see, the first advantage is that it allows you to have an overflow space when the memory fills up. It is also possible to move elements that would not be very useful in the swap memory. This would allow the speed of RAM to be reserved for other more critical applications. And it is possible to put the system in hibernation mode. This is a much deeper standby, as the RAM will be completely unloaded in the swap partition and will therefore wake up longer than a traditional sleep mode. Let's move on to the disadvantages. Well, first of all, it's that it takes up space on your hard drive, because the problem is that swap partitions don't dynamically resize, and it could also increase the wear and tear of your hard drive, because it is asked to work like a RAM memory. We've seen the file systems for Windows and Linux. We have one left to see which one is the one to reserve for Mac PCs. The HFS, Hierarchical File System. This is Apple's proprietary system, which allows operating systems to be launched on Mac OS. As the HFS format is a Macintosh format, Windows computers will not be able to recognize drives of this type. Basically, you should know that the HFS type could not support large hard drives. That's why Apple has released an extended version of its file format that is simply called HFS+. The last two types of files, which have nothing to do with operating systems, are CDFS, Compact Disk File System, and NFS, Network File System. CDFS is the dedicated file system for compact disks, i.e., it is mainly used to store data on CDs. An NFS is a networked file system. It is in fact a client-server application that allows a user to consult or modify files hosted on a remote computer. Basically, it's the dedicated format for file servers. This allows you to work collaboratively on the same document and to centralize files in the same server. Fast and slow formatting. And before we finish this course, we're going to quickly see the difference between a quick format or not. You should know that a quick format will take a few seconds, while a normal format will take several hours. So, what justifies these differences? Is the disk better erased? Well, actually, of course. Quick Format, as the name suggests, will quickly format your drive without bothering to check the drive if it has bad sectors. While the normal formatting will mostly take time to scan the bad sectors. It's a bit of a myth to say that the data will be totally erased. You should know that a quick or normal formatting does not permanently erase the data from your drive. If you really want to delete all the data, then you'll have to use software that is designed to really erase all your data.